The coral reef is a diverse and complicated ecosystem. It is comprised of numerous interesting and important organisms that help support every other organism in the ecosystem. It is beautiful, complex, interesting, and in danger, but more on that later. Like I said before, the coral reef is a very intricate system of organisms that all affect each other in different ways. In order to map out exactly how each organism affects the others, I will now draw a food web of our school coral reef on the whiteboard of science. The producers, algae, and phytoplankton are in green and feed all the primary consumers: flame shells, long-spined sea urchins, cleaner bunny, and especially zooplankton. The zooplankton and algae feed the secondary consumers and omnivores in blue. This includes the hippotang, ocellaris, clown, green chromis, coupang damsel, yellow tang, sailfin tang, naso tang, and all small crustaceans, which in addition to zooplankton are the primary food source for the tertiary consumer carnivores. This includes the sand-sifting starfish, brittle starfish, S. anthias, royal gamma, bang-eye cardinal, firefish, long-nosed hawk, chalk-face, B. anthias, scooter bunny, diamond goby, D. anthias, and all coral anemones. These organisms are considered the top of the food chain. Deadly. Terrifying. Little fishy. Feeding off of the waste and deceased organisms of the ecosystem are the detritivores, featured in a nearly invisible color at the bottom of the web. This includes the blood, cleaner, and coral banded shrimp, all of whom have very intense names for creatures that eat dead things. On second thought, that's actually pretty appropriate. As you can see, this food web is complicated. So we're also going to take a look at a different way to organize the organisms in the coral reef, in a trophic structure. A trophic structure lists all the same organisms in a similar manner to the way that I just tried, but it focuses more on the energy passed between levels of organisms and doesn't list what organism eats what specific organism. It's set up exactly how you'd expect, with producers being on the bottom and the largest section of the triangle, and the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers going up in level but down in amount of available energy. As the energy progresses through the trophic levels, the amount of available energy for the organisms on that level is about 10% of what was available at the last level. In this model, as with our food web, it is clear that the algae and phytoplankton are very important to this ecosystem, which leads me to conclude two things. One, this ecosystem is set up in a bottom-up model, meaning that the whole ecosystem relies on the organisms on the bottom of the trophic structure. And two, algae and zooplankton are the keystone species in the ecosystem. A keystone species is a species whose presence in the ecosystem sometimes inexplicably dictates the survival of that ecosystem. As you can see in the food web, the algae and zooplankton have the most organisms depending on them as a source of energy, so it's safe to assume that the presence of these organisms would make or break the survival of most of the other creatures in the system, making them keystone species. For algae, its role as a keystone species is due in part to its role as a producer, one of the only producers in the ecosystem. It's in incredibly high demand because of how much energy it creates and passes through the trophic levels, and the number of other organisms indirectly it supports. This includes, by extension, all kinds of coral. It is a common misconception that coral is a plant, when it is actually a carnivorous organism, an animal, consuming whatever zooplankton will drift close enough to its mouth. The algae, with the help of various nutrients in the ecosystem, are responsible for the ecosystem's primary productivity, how much light energy is converted into chemical energy by the autotrophs. In aquatic ecosystems, the amount of light that penetrates the water and the limiting nutrients in the ecosystem, like phosphorus and nitrogen, also affect the productivity of the system. But you may be wondering, why are nitrogen and phosphorus limiting nutrients, and how do they enter the coral reef ecosystem? Well, there you have it. The nitrogen is taken from the unusable atmospheric nitrogen and turned into a usable form by bacteria. This is then absorbed/consumed by the fish and other animals in the coral reef. It is then excreted as waste and used as fertilizer by the plants in the ecosystem. It is then sent back out as atmospheric nitrogen to begin the cycle again. As for phosphorus, it's a bit more difficult to describe its cycle in relation to the coral reef as it has less of an effect on the system. Phosphorus gets brought into the water through the weathering of rocks on land containing phosphorus. It then gets carried into this ecosystem and taken up by algae and other producers in the ecosystem. It's then sent up through the trophic levels and eventually hardens into sediment and finds its way to the shoreline again to start the cycle over. When talking about any kind of an ecosystem, it is also very important to address how carbon works its way through the system. In this case, carbon enters by being absorbed from the atmosphere as CO2 by producers and used with water and sunlight to make glucose and oxygen through photosynthesis. This is then used by consumers to make CO2 and water. Once these organisms die and decompose, the CO2 is released back into the environment to be sent into the cycle again. However, as the pollution of the atmosphere by humans increases, the system becomes more and more of an issue and is leading to the widespread death of many of the world's coral reefs. When I said at the beginning of the video that the coral reef as an ecosystem is in danger, it wasn't just a grab line. Ocean acidification is the lowering of the pH level of the world's oceans, or increasing their acidity, as caused by the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. As atmospheric CO2 from air pollution increases, so does the acidity of the water. Because coral reefs live in an environment that is usually between 7.5 and 8.4 on the pH scale, the lowering of the pH level is devastating, causing the bleaching of coral and death or migration of the fish and other organisms that rely on the coral reef for a home. In addition to this, global warming is wreaking havoc on the delicate balance of the coral reef ecosystem. Because of water's high specific heat, it can afford to absorb a lot of heat from its surroundings while only raising its temperature a little. This is why aquatic environments are usually so temperate and good for life. However, as the Earth's climate changes, the temperature of ecosystems around the world, especially aquatic ones like coral reefs, rise to the point where organisms can't stand it. It's not just those two threats attacking the coral reefs either. There's also overfishing, water pollution through the dumping of sewage, the effect of garbage on fish, and mercury poisoning to major species. Really, it's all looking pretty bleak for the coral reefs. However, there is a way to help. Do your part to support organizations working towards the conservation and preservation of ocean habitats around the world, and get educated. Coral reefs and other aquatic ecosystems have the most biodiversity out of all the ecosystems on Earth. We need to do our best to keep them around.